cases have slid across my desk over the years, ranging from the weird to the weirder and finally to the weirdest. I've looked into publishers, developers, and absolute legends, but no company has took a stranger swath to success than Ubisoft.
What the fuck is that?
In fact, looking at their file here, they shouldn't have even come close to success to begin with, like, at all. It's a path littered with oddities and diversions, whereas nowadays it's just... And don't forget, these are all different games, mind you. So how did an obscure French company who pushed out titles featuring limbless horrors and Pamela Anderson Drek become one of the powerhouse publishers of the video game industry? Well, let's see if we can find a clue, a method to the madness on how Ubisoft succeeded when so many others failed doing the exact same thing. This is the case of the Parisian pencil pushers. Ubisoft came into existence in 1986 via Yves Guillemot of the Guillemot dynasty and seemed to suckle eagerly at the bountiful bosom of the Amstrad PC, something, just judging by its name, is probably an ancient artifact that only the 4 richest kings of Europe actually owned. Their output during the late 80s was, to put it mildly, incredibly French and incredibly productive, releasing 31 games in 4 years. It's dotted with such classics as Le Necromancien, Mange Caillou, Conspiration de l'An 3, and on top of them all, Zombie, which we'll swing back around on. There's really not much else to examine here. These games were French, and they look like this. Things remained in this weird nexus of European obscurity until 1991, where Ubi very randomly published Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade for the NES of all things. Which Indiana Jones game is that? Well, that'd be this one. The one that looks like it was coated on a piece of papyrus. With this first exciting flirtation, Ubisoft developed an insatiable taste for this type of publishing in the decades to come. The type of sopping, sweaty pit that few people ever crawl out of, the licensed game pit. Their output also slowed down significantly in the 90s, releasing 56 games in 10 years. Things were still going doucement until a young designer named Michel Ancel developed Rayman, which went on to be one of Ubi's first big marketable hits. A weird French goblin fairy, a collection of body parts floating via arcane magics? I don't know what the hell he is. I doubt Ancel knows either. The next blip on the radar came 2 years after Rayman's 1995 debut, where Ubi graced the video game world with something that defies generations, culture, and even life itself.
What about now? It's time to rock with the biggity buck bumble. What about now? It's time to rock with the biggity buck bumble. Bum to the bump to the bump.
Yeah, you're welcome, man, dude.
It's really cool.
Also, don't forget about Hype the Time Quest! Wow, is this even good? I might need to follow up on this one down the road. We're now reaching the tail end of the 90s, which will also give us our first clue into how Ubisoft got to where it is. The late Tom Clancy had already established his own video game studio, Red Storm Entertainment, but Ubisoft wound up publishing their first big hit with Rainbow Six. Now, since Mr. Clancy Wiggum was already using his name for said games, Ubisoft didn't really need to pay for them in the traditional sense. Red Storm made these games fast and they made them pretty cheap, featuring addictive tactical FPS gameplay that had a good bit of replayability. Within less than 4 years, Ubisoft purchased Red Storm and the Tom Clancy name became theirs. His name would then be continually slapped on games long after his death, so even to some punk kid who had no idea what a Mom Clancy was, they did know it meant tactical shooter or stealth game, and especially Ubisoft. As we enter the futuristic time period of the 2000s, the natural follow-up to Rainbow Six, of course, was Tom Clancy's Animorphs. Just Animorphs. And why not wash that down with Ubi's first foray into superheroing with Batman Beyond: Return of the Joker? Woof. One of the Dark Knight's darkest chapters. Now, while not nearly as famous as its Kryptonian cousin, this indeed is Ubisoft's Superman 64, and by some metrics, it's even slightly worse. However, unlike other French publisher Titus, who died soon after their licensed DC disaster, Ubi were able to push on, publishing games faster and harder than ever, not stopping for any reason. They dipped into Disney for a bit with 2 titles. Dinosaur, remember that? Of course you don't. And Donald Duck Going Quackers, the game that would later inspire Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time. No, I'm not lying. Know what movie really needed a video game adaptation? Why, Little Nicky, of course, for the Game Boy Color, which I'm pretty sure doesn't really exist. Now, what's the next move when you've conquered the entertainment world by releasing an Adam Sandler game? How about strapping into a goddamn Armored Core? Like, is this the Mandela effect thing? Ubisoft didn't publish Armored Core, it was Namco or something, right? No? Okay, so it was only for Europe, but still, when I think of Armored Core, the last thing I associated with it is Ubisoft. Now, I guess they were then bolstered by the success of Batman Beyond, because Ubi then released 3 Batman games in 1 year. Batman Vengeance, Batman Gotham City Racer, and Batman Chaos in Gotham, whatever the hell that is. It's for the Game Boy Color.
Get into it!
Now, let's take a sec here to examine Batman Vengeance.
The transmitter you gave Mary last night. It's coming from Gotham Bridge.
Right.
This was one of Ubisoft Montreal's earlier efforts that showed what they could really do. It was based on the Bruce Timm series and featured an authentic art style and amounted to a pretty elaborate action-adventure, one of the best early 3D efforts for the Cape Crusader.
Say goodnight, Batsy!
Careful, Harley! You'll kill him!
It's with this game that Ubi's Montreal office, which opened in 1997, proved that they were an asset for the company. Vengeance also marked the last Batman game they would ever release, which of course, as we'll see, is a massive lie. We are now in 2001, which just so happened to be one of Ubi's most prolific years. They published a total of 28 games. 28 games in 12 months. That almost tops everything they put out in the 80s. It widely ranged between Planet of the Apes for the PlayStation 1, which was sort of based on the Tim Burton adaptation, but it wasn't really, as that movie didn't release until 2002, so they kind of used some of the marketing imagery, but not the story or the characters. Man, this is so weird in and of itself. I might need to investigate it further in a future case file. Speaking of the PlayStation 1, Ubi really seemed to like publishing on it, and in a creepy sort of way. It was still releasing titles on the PSX well into the PS2's life cycle up until 2002. One such title was VIP, starring Pamela Anderson, released on Windows, the PlayStation 2, and the Game Boy Advance. So if you needed your PG-13 polygonal titillation, Ubisoft had you covered. One more similar project that has the distinction of being their very last effort on the PSX was one of the most banal, mundane, time-wasting racers you could ever play, but you gotta keep playing it to see clips like...
Hi y'all, welcome to Georgia.
And of course...
Congratulations!
Congratulations!
This was Hooters Road Trip and exemplifies the dichotomy of Ubisoft. In the same month, they would release something like this, right along something like this. Ubi, I know Tom Clancy games sell or whatever, but how about returning to the vaunted Hooters franchise once more? It's about time. And that's just a taste of the company's early aughts. It was a decade of hedonistic publishing. Oh, a game about killing cops? Sign us up. Survival horror? Hell yeah. Ape Escape? Why not? Crouching Tiger? Hidden Dragon? Cats? Worms? Death Row? Mike Tyson? Rocky? This Metabots thing? I don't know what it is. Charlie's Angels? Just throw it on the pile. More Batman? Yes, please. Cel-shaded first-person shooters based on obscure French bande dessinées? They actually published that. Ubisoft used to serve all kinds. If you had a particular gaming kink, they had something that could satiate it. Now, why did this publishing style eventually cause so much long-term damage to someone like THQ and not Ubisoft? Well, between all of this, a publishing strategy based on rolling a bingo cage, Ubisoft started sowing the seeds around the early aughts that they would then need to cultivate, which would produce a bountiful harvest down the line. Two of these pillars were Prince of Persia and the aforementioned military author man. The rights to the former were acquired pretty cheaply, as the Prince of Persia brand had changed hands multiple times, and that was the perfect project to hand to their up-and-coming Montreal office, who made it into a multiple Game of the Year award winner. Tom Clancy shooters were also no slouch, as the Ghost Recon series was receiving similar praise at the time, and the brand also spawned its first real marketable character, Sam Fisher of Splinter Cell. Another UB Montreal joint, this proved that the IP could move into completely different genres, not just tactical shooters, and set a precedent for what UB would achieve by simply slapping an author's name on their game boxes. This also meant that they could now afford to produce some expensive titles that might perform less than ideally. Case in point, Michel Ancel's Beyond Good and Evil, a masterclass in gaming design and narrative, but was criminally looked over at the time. Then, in 2004, another project UB decided to just randomly publish was the first game by an unknown developer known as Crytek. Their FPS, Far Cry, didn't have much initial buzz leading up to its release, but the engine it used, also named Crytek, was a revelation for FPSs and a benchmark for graphical horsepower. Allowing you to wreak havoc in a sandbox setting, Crytek impressed a lot of people a lot of quickly. If you hadn't heard of Far Cry before, then you were definitely hearing about it now. Behind the scenes though, UB not only published Far Cry, but bought the entire IP from Crytek, and man, did they make the most of that. Nowadays, Crytek is every so often flirting with bankruptcy, as their Crysis series sputtered out with EA years ago, while Ubisoft is, doing a little better. However, 2005 was still another banner year for movie licenses, with maybe Ubisoft's most famous of all, King Kong, the official game of the movie The Game, released of course on goddamn everything. Roll call! Microsoft Windows, Microsoft Xbox, Microsoft Xbox 360, PlayStation 2, PlayStation Portable, Nintendo DS, Nintendo Game Boy Advance, and Nintendo GameCube. UB released this on the Switch or the PS4, just buy the license again for this 15-year-old game. This is stupid advice, so you should do it. Do it! Now, after years of slumming it with licensed movie Drek, UB decided a different tact here to put one of their stars, Michel Ancel, onto the project to bring experience and class to it. In all my digging around, I've come to one conclusion. This is still a pretty cool game, movie licensed or not. It did some really neat things with the HUD, had some early but unobtrusive survival elements, there were lots of fun monsters to shoot, and button mashing with Kong was really satisfying. Yeah, the later part of the game gets a bit repetitive, and the New York section is a tad undercooked, but this is still one of the best, most polished video game experiences you can get that was based on a film. Not content with just Peter Jackson, however, UB also felt that same year to take a light speed jump to a galaxy far, far away with Star Wars. Yeah, let's do Star Wars, try to stop us. They specifically published the handheld adaptations of Revenge of the Sith, as well as two other games based on the original trilogy, Flight of the Falcon, which was bad, and Lethal Alliance, which was also bad, but I still personally love it. Isn't that weird though? There were tons of Star Wars games released around the time on consoles and handhelds, but for whatever reason, Ubisoft snagged the rights to publish just Revenge of the Sith and two non-canon nothings. 2006 followed 2005, as it usually does, and this was a big year for Far Cry for some reason. There was Far Cry Instincts in late 2005, which was a rejiggered version of Far Cry 1, just for the Xbox, and was published and developed by UB. Following that, there was Far Cry Instincts Evolution, a sequel to the last game released just a year later, then Far Cry Instincts Predator, an enhanced Xbox 360 version, and finally, Far Cry Vengeance for the Wii, which is one of the best worst games of all time, right alongside Red Steel 1.
The gods have heard my prayers, my lord, and brought you back to us.
A sword and a gun brought me back, Luigi. Not prayers.
Mwah! 2006 also marked the year where Ubisoft would publish Devil May Cry 3. And in case you think I stuttered, let me say it again. Ubisoft published Devil May Cry 3. I guess if their competition was too lazy to publish their titles in Europe, Ubi would sweep in and just do it for them, those sly dogs. During all of this, however, something was happening behind the scenes, something that would define the company for decades to come. Ubi took the diminishing returns on more Prince of Persia sequels and started funneling it into another project that they would then, once again, 100% own themselves. Before we get to that, however, we need to examine what else occurred in 2007, cause damn, 2007 made 2006 look like 2001. What type of madman releases? Within the same year, Beowulf the Game, CSI, Hard Evidence, Imagine Babies, No More Heroes, Naruto, Rise of Ninja, My Spanish Coach, TMNT, Rocky Balboa, Armored Core, For Answer, some fucking dinosaur game, and Resident Evil goddamn 4. I guess Capcom and Ubi got along famously because following up on their bad PC port of DMC3, they released a bad PC port of Leon's Spanish Vacation as well. The most important release that year, however, was Assassin's Creed. Built off the back of Sands of Time, Ubi spun that whole idea into its own multimedia mega empire, and with it, the three holy cows were born. Three magical beasts that are still being milked to this day. Once these three revenue streams were put into place, Ubi didn't really need to do all that weird shit that they were doing, and rather than just abandon all that weird shit that they were doing, they gradually just slowly phased it out. This is in stark contrast to THQ, who suddenly decided to pivot their entire business strategy, and for them, we're far too late doing it. Anyway, forget what I said about 2007, because here comes the monster whopper that was 2008. Haze, Far Cry 2, Imagine Party Babies.
I just about died because of you.
The game based on Lost, My SAT Coach, another Naruto, another Prince of Persia, a Carrot Top snowboarding game, and most important of all, the awesome ladies from Totally Spies making their video game debut. 2009 saw Grey's Anatomy, which in my younger days I tested, a Ninja Turtle Smash clone, Tenchu, yes Tenchu, which I also tested, Just Dance, Call of Juarez, actual physical laser tag, Asterix and Obelix, Velvet Assassin, and finally, Wheelman. Not to be confused, of course, with Driver, which Ubi also owned. Now, while that's a lot to chew on, it was a less insane schedule than previous years, as this was also a transitional time for the company. 2009 marked Ubi's attempt to recapture the success of Donkey Kong, the official movie of the game, by betting hard on James Cameron's Blue Furries. It didn't really pay off. While inoffensive, the adaptations of Avatar for HD consoles and the Wii proved to be costly ventures, while Ubi's own franchises like Assassin's Creed and Tom Clancy were outperforming them. They then decided to scale back what they were putting into licensed IPs, as across the board the subgenre was losing its sales luster, which kind of ironically was due to the negative perception fans had on movie licensed games. Over the shaky early efforts, Ubisoft themselves farted out. Thus, their output in this space slowed down, but there was still a trickle of releases for a few more years. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, RIP, an NCIS game or two. Man, how many entries does that have? Jesus Christ! Some Smurf games, Expendables 2, that weird Avengers thing, remember that? A free-to-play Spartacus game, and, well, I guess South Park counts. In the subsequent years, it got thinner and thinner, as Ubi's yearly schedule was dominated by yearly Tom Clancy, Far Cry, Just Dance, and Assassin's Creed titles. Damn, 3 Assassin's Creed projects released in 2015 alone. Syndicate, Chronicles, and whatever I assume Mobile Muck Identity was. Therefore, Ubi would rely on those core franchises and would only very occasionally dip into something riskier, or at least different. Remember the UbiArt engine? Yeah, that gorgeous thing that powered like 4 games ever and was then just abandoned? Remember how fun an idea Far Cry Blood Dragon was, and how New Dawn is a less interesting version of that in every way? Hey, Beyond Good and Evil is back, I think, but now it's an online sort of MMO. Yeah, I'm not even sure anymore. Ubisoft now seems fairly content to simply pump out the same few franchises year after year, which I guess is what everyone else is doing. These franchises are also increasingly becoming games as a service, or at least really close to it, but they still have a pretty diverse catalog of franchises to dabble with. How about putting out some smaller digital-only titles for stuff like Rayman, Prince of Persia, or Hooters Road Trip? Just go crazy every few years. Now, that's not to say that they don't occasionally dip into something from out of left field, but these feel like sort of half-hearted attempts, and they never really commit to them. It was because of the positioning of just a few core franchises that they were either able to buy on the cheap or transform into something else that Ubi were able to crawl out of their way of the licensed game hell. And as we've seen out of all the major pubs nowadays, Ubi used to be the most eclectic and random of them all, as they published just about everything and anything to see what would work, but also made some early smart decisions that paid off in the end. Again, far smarter strategy than manically trying to course correct after a number of catastrophic failures. So, there you have it. Ubisoft, a company not known for taking many risks in the modern era, but in its 20s it was a wild and crazy thing, shacking up with just about anyone that came knocking on their door. In the future, I wager we'll see even less of that wild side, so I think we can consider this case closed. Know of any other curios nestled deep in the video game industry, various phenomena, mysteries, or oddball myths? Drop a line in the comments below and I'll see if I can take a closer look at it on the Flophouse Files.
Congratulations! You made it all the way!
It's not the easiest thing in the world to bottle up lightning, and in the case of Midway in the 1990s, it proved almost impossible. The company behind Mortal Kombat knew they had one of the hottest franchises in video gamedom: violence, blood, or sometimes sweat. They were completely annihilating everything else on the market for a few years with a flawless victory. But internally, things were lacking. Aside from a sports title or a light gun shooter, they weren't as adept at mimicking their own successes when it came to fighting games. This was something, however, that Capcom excelled at, making dozens of fighters off the back of their initial successes within the genre. Things like X-Men, Marvel, Darkstalkers, Rival Schools, and of course, Street Fighter, the movie. Midway was very less good at this, but in 1996, 5 years after MK's debut, they sure gave it the old college try. This is the case of the Combat Carbon copies. Now, we're going to need to start off with some additional context. After 1995's Mortal Kombat 3 of both the vanilla and ultimate flavors, Midway was flush with cash, pushing the franchise in just about every direction it could go.
My name is Shang Tsung.
For better or for worse.
Alright.
There was one place it hadn't been yet, the third dimension. Now, 3D had started off with fighting games all the way back in 1993, courtesy of Yu Suzuki. Therefore, the next entry in the series would go kind of 3D with MK4, as well as some baby steps with MK Mythology's Sub-Zero, which was one half 2D, one half 3D, and all frustrating. Around this time, Midway's various studios swelled with more teams, and with the fighting game boom still going on and 3D seemingly looking like the next big thing, they enacted their three-pronged plan. Phase 1 started with 1996's War Gods, which was made by a smaller team within Midway. It was initially thought to be an early test for Mortal Kombat 4, and you could certainly make that argument because it was exactly like Mortal Kombat 4. It had the same control layout, even keeping the block button for some reason. Had uppercuts, sweeps, fatalities, the announcer even straight up says, "Fatality!" It had all of the Mortal Kombats. Its story and characters were also not too outside the MK wheelhouse. An ancient being bringing various warriors, some mystic in origin, together in a fight to the death to claim a bounty of ore, a mysterious substance from the stars that grants ultimate power. Alright, roll call. Anubis, Warhead, Sci-Fi, Vala, Aokin, Tak, Maximus, Kabuki Joe, Voodoo, and the two big green boys, Grox, he's supposed to be Goro, but he's Grox, and Zior, Izor. He'll be playing your Shao Kahn for the evening. Much noise was made over the game's graphical techniques, including the way they rendered the characters via a bit of a technology called digital skin, which was essentially a photo of an actor, which was then mapped on to the character model. So, yeah, you mean a texture map? Yeah, they actually did have some characters, though, dress up for some photo shoots, including Mortal Kombat's own Kerry Hoskins, and then recreated them in 3D. MK4 was also going to use digital skin, but then dropped that altogether for reasons we shall see. Now, why did War Gods never catch on? Hype name, violent, plays like Mortal Kombat, and it's 3D, which is like a whole extra dimension. Well, a lot of small things, really. It did very little that was new, other than a 3D dodge maneuver, which was novel at the time, and an expanded combo system, giving the War Gods Tekken-like 10-hit strings. The game, while playing like Mortal Kombat, also played slightly clunkier, as this was Midway's first fully 3D arcade game, a stark difference to the fast and frenetic Ultimate MK3. And while fun in a cheesy 90s way, the characters and story didn't really grab hold like the world Ed Boon and John Tobias crafted. Speaking of Mr. Noob, he and the Mortal Kombat team were quick to disassociate from Gods of War. Even 10 years later, Ed maintains that they were never consulted for anything regarding it, and it was handled by a completely separate team. Going back to the game now, however, it's actually a silly but fun little fighter. Playing as mythological gods like Anubis or even close enough parallels like Vala, it's always a neat thing. It's not incredibly deep, but has a certain over-the-top charm that's undeniable. Its PlayStation N64 ports didn't do much to bolster its image, but they did come with fun Midway-like codes and secrets to play as the bosses. You like 90s fighting games in early 3D? Well, you can do worse than War Gods. Undaunted, though, the very next year, Midway was responsible for putting out another violent 3D fighter, but they weren't the ones who actually developed it. Atari's lingering arcade division, who had previously put out Primal Rage, were brought under the same banner as Midway when Williams purchased them in late 1996, which led to Midway publishing the next curious curio in our lineup. Mace: The Dark Age was an attempt to marry Mortal Kombat violence and aesthetics to the weapon-based gameplay and time period of Namco's Soul Blade series, which had its first entry in 1995. Mace, however, made it to the arcades almost a year before Soul Calibur would then blow up the scene. Mace and its Dark Age centered around the powerful Mace of Tanis MacGuffin, an immensely intense weapon that was wielded by one Asmodeus, with every selectable character vying to wield it. Arenas were big, rendered in full 3D, and were totally explorable, but don't venture too far, as they sometimes were dotted with hazards that would cause damage to either combatant. This lineup of medieval marauders included Mordos Kull, Koyasha, Namira, Al-Rashid, Ragnar, Takeshi, Sir Dragon, Zhao Long, Taria, the Executioner, Lord Deimos, Hell Knight, Warmech, Ichiro, and of course, Ned and Pojo. And much like War Gods, and therefore much like Mortal Kombat, there was also a sub and final boss. The first was Grendel, taken from the Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf, and then Asmodeus himself, who appears as a multi-armed dragon entity. The camera in Mace was also fairly dynamic, swinging around the arenas to show the action from the best perspective, and the stages themselves were meticulously designed. The music, that leaned very hard into the realm of heavy metal, would still take inspiration from the countries each fighter hailed from. It also looked incredibly impressive in 1997, running on the 3DFX Voodoo arcade hardware, much like Hydro Thunder did, and for a time was one of the best looking games in the arcade, having a distinctive next-gen look. Now, despite all this going for it, fun varied characters, cool graphics, and polished presentation, the game did play rather sluggishly compared to other 3D fighters, and featured a more methodical pace, as well as lacking the same gameplay depth offered by Tekken or Virtua Fighter. Each warrior in Mace had a standard amount of special moves and only one fatality each, this time called Execution.
Execute him!
So it wasn't exactly the type of thing you could keep going back to again and again. Atari Games then fell under the Williams umbrella officially, so Mace would see a competent N64 port published by Midway and GT Interactive. It, however, was criticized for playing even slower and not ideally on the N64 control pad. The graphics and sound also took the expected hit, and a PlayStation version, which was planned and worked on, was cancelled before release. This led some to believe that either the N64 or arcade version itself wasn't a big enough success for Midway to invest in it any further. Now, let's get to the bottom of this. The idea of an edgier, more violent 3D fighter in the vein of Soul Blade should have found an audience. It might be because by 1997 it was hard for new fighting games to make much of an impact, as Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, and all of the SNKs were dominating 2D, while Tekken, Virtua Fighter, and Dead or Alive had 3D on lock. As time dragged on, it was getting harder and harder for new franchises to gain any ground. And as we delve further and further into those 90s, the genre was also just growing less and less, with so much competition vying for the players' quarters. Midway, however, were still undeterred, as they had yet another fighter in the works, with the exact same strategy: make it 3D, make it violent, and release in arcades and on the N64 and PlayStation. This was 1998's Bio Freaks, the Freaks of course standing for Flying, Robotic, Enhanced Armored Killing Synthoids. And it's probably the most unique, so close to an actual thing fighter that Midway ever put out. It was also made by a third-party studio who Midway had no investment in, that being Sapphire Entertainment, who had previously handled the home version of Rampage World Tour. BioFreaks definitely had some things going for it. Chiefly, it's one of the earliest examples of the arena fighter, beating other similar games like Power Stone or Wu-Tang Shaolin style to the punch by a few years. Players could navigate large 3D stages with a jetpack, hence the flying, and everyone was equipped with some type of long-range gun attack and a shield to avoid incoming damage. Out of all three titles Midway attempted, BioFreaks also took some risks with the atmosphere and setting, going for a far-off dystopian future ruled by mega corporations, and has one of the coolest intro texts in fighting games.
While the government tried to keep control of the country, the effect of the giant corporations' white-collar wars drove the economy into a tailspin. With Wall Street in shambles, the government bankrupt, and technological corporate giants running unorthodox takeovers, Neo-America was born.
So yes, each flying robotic enhanced armored killing synthzoid was sponsored by a really evil mega corporation, all vying to win the tournament and to crush their competition. This imaginative roster consists of Bullseye, Delta, Sabotage, Minitech, Cycloud, Purge, Zipperhead, and finally,
The God, Emperor Sabo!
There was also a final boss named Mutilator, which the less said about is the better. BioFreaks let you rip off limbs mid-fight, explode your opponent's head, fall into acid or fire, launch some crazy combos and setups, and each character had a fairly big move list. The futuristic setting and crazy designs gave it an almost Twisted Metal style look and feel, and the music and presentation went a long way into feeding into that. The game unfortunately didn't test well in arcades, as the very defensive nature of the jetpack and shooting gameplay led to many timeouts. So while it was initially tested there and the ROM was leaked, it never got a full widespread arcade release. Both N64 and PlayStation owners got ports, but it was a very no-frills affair, not featuring any additional playable characters, secrets, or modes, which could have been a strike against it. It's really a shame about this one, because unlike War Gods or Mace, BioFreaks was doing something very different, both in terms of aesthetics and gameplay. Sapphire, however, would go on to make similar fighters with both Xeno Xena Warrior Princess for the N64, featuring 4-player brawls, as well as Barbarian on the PS2, which was a much more refined version of the same concept. Still though, like our other 2 fighting games we've dissected today, Midway just wasn't able to make this one stick. Putting out 3 brand new fighting games in 3 years was probably not the best approach, because each one was eating into the same demographic: violent 3D games in the style of Mortal Kombat. This, in conjunction with all the competition and the popularity of fighting games gradually fading, are all factors as to Bio-War Freak Gods, the Dark Age, didn't see the same success as its big brother. It was nice, however, that Midway got progressively bolder, getting more and more unique with each game, and in BioFreaks' case, maybe a bit too unique. But what about today? Well, Mortal Kombat is arguably bigger, but some wouldn't say better than it's ever been, as MK11 is currently the best-selling game of 2019. Its gear system and all of its unlockable costumes and skins, though, well, that leads to an interesting idea. Warner Bros. Wound up buying many of Midway's languishing IPs, most of their back catalog, in fact. Now, in terms of costumes and guest characters, in Street Fighter V, Capcom was pulled from other franchises like Darkstalkers, Captain Commando, and many others for inspiration. Therefore, it would be a real deep cut if Warner Bros. Could dip into the rosters of these forgotten fighters, especially since NetherRealm drops Easter eggs and inside jokes into many of their games. Why not? Why the hell not? You have the platform to do so. You feature lots of guest characters you then recycle out of older guest characters, so how about a Lord Deimos armor set for Shao Kahn, or zipperhead parts for the Collector, and hell, why can't Geras turn into a dog-headed Egyptian death deity? Or how about make them just DLC characters, just go nuts on it? If not that, then how about a re-release? An HD digital collection featuring all 3, and hell, MK4 as well, which never got a re-release anyway. The Midway Fighting Games Origin Collection 3D. Crazier things have happened. Okay, well, maybe they haven't. But I think we got to the bottom of all this, shined some light on each of the game's strengths and weaknesses, and even found a way for these old titles to get a second life. So with that, the case of the Combat Carbon copies is closed. See you next time, fellow gumshoes, on the Flophouse Files. In this line of work, you tend to come across a rogues gallery of unscrupulous characters. There's unfeeling, faceless corporations, sketchy madmen who luck their way into fame and fortune with a good lie and a coy smile, and then there's the middle-of-the-road grifters, the ones that came and went and thought their shit didn't stink, and no one exemplified this better than the clowns and miscreants that made up Acclaim Entertainment. Founded in 1987 by former Activision employees, something I'm sure will shock exactly 0 of you, Acclaim got by in these early days by securing a number of lucrative licenses, from popular movies to professional wrestling, before sliming their way into a business relationship with Midway, publishing many of their arcade hits like Mortal Kombat, Revolution X, and others. They made some questionable acquisitions in the late 90s, however, purchasing Valiant Comics and renaming them Acclaim Comics for reasons that I don't actually know. But it did, however, grant them access to characters which became synonymous with the Acclaim name, namely Turok the Dinosaur Hunter and the Man of Shadows himself, Shadow Man. One thing Acclaim learned from the success of Mortal Kombat, a license they eventually lost, is that controversy almost always equates to sales, as pushing violent fare into the video game marketplace seemed to pay dividends in the 90s. Thus, much the same strategy was applied to pretty much everything Acclaim published after that point. And it's just about at that point, without MK to rely on, where Acclaim's most infamous stunts were born. Sleazy, desperate attempts for relevancy, and headlines in a marketplace that was rapidly outgrowing them. This is the case of the moronic marketing maestros. Now, there's a note at the bottom of the case file here. Yes, the following baffling examples of over-the-top marketing misfires were 99% the brainchildren of Acclaim UK and not their main North American office, although, to be fair, Acclaim USA probably signed off on all these harebrained schemes. Still though, these stunts were all concocted by those daft Brits. Let's start with Acclaim's main claim to fame. Now that's a terrible line, which is the dinosaur hunter himself, Turok. Now, by the end of the N64's lifespan, he wasn't exactly the talk of the town anymore, but Acclaim wasn't a company that would leave well enough alone. So after the 4th straight game in the series, a multi-platform sequel called Turok Evolution was set to bring the character swinging into the next generation. However, Acclaim at that very moment was on their last legs financially, so to draw up some groundswell for the release, the marketing teams decided to enact a harmless but nonetheless idiotic contest. Legally change your name to Turok. This insanity came in 2 flavors. Acclaim New York offered $10,000 in bonds to any parents willing to legally name their newborn children after the Son of Stone. Acclaim UK, the Nutters, offered to anyone, regardless of age, £500 and an Xbox console if they changed their name to Turok, to which thousands of people were willing to do. Acclaimed snake oil salesman Alan Lewis tried to make sense of this madness and what even the point of it was. Video games are the fastest growing segment of the entertainment industry. We're always looking at new ways to reach an audience, and because it's for games, we can have a little fun. We're giving birth to our biggest game, so it's a natural tie-in. People have been naming their kids after movie and sports celebrities for years. Why not games? If you say so, buddy. I mean, it's very unclear how this would have even helped the game sell, like conceptually as well as in practice. It's like, okay, thanks for filling this form out, Mr. Turok. Yeah, I changed my name for money. Okay, whatever. I didn't ask for your life story. I mean, maybe if you called yourself, oh hi, the name's Turok Evolution, out August 28th for the Xbox, PS2, and GameCube. How are you doing? Then maybe that might pique someone's interest. It's an icebreaker at parties at the very least. Marketing analyst Shelley Olhava also weighed in on this unique campaign when it was announced. While such promotions can help boost a game's profile, they're not enough to sway savvy game buyers. You can do all the crazy stunts you want, but if the game stinks, nobody's going to buy it. And considering the game was Turok Evolution, nobody bought it. In fact, Evolution was so expensive and a sales disaster for Acclaim, it's considered to be one of the main factors to cause the company's extinction. Next up, you might remember Gladiator Sword of Vengeance, the unmemorable hack and slasher released on the Xbox and PS2, but not the GameCube, because if you recall, that's a dumb kid's toy for babies. Anyway, Gladiator took ancient mythology but let you cut a bloody swath through it with a tragic hero on a quest for redemption. Remind you of anything? Anything at all? That's right, it was a blatant copy of God of War, except it super wasn't. As shocking as it may seem, Gladiator actually predates God of War by a good 2 years. Yeah, it's actually a ripoff of Gladiator, the film, just with more blood. Oh, Acclaim, that so fits your MO.
Fatality.
Anyway, to celebrate the fact that Gladiator was apparently the bloodiest video game ever made, which is extremely debatable, Acclaim UK decided once again to innovate in the area of marketing with something they themselves dubbed as bloodvertising. In various bus stations and billboards dotted around the UK, clear sheets of plastic inside the glass of the bus shelters would systematically release red-colored dye for 6 days leading to the game's launch. Said dye would then spill onto the pavement and just stay there, staining the streets and sidewalks. Marketing charlatan Sean White, no, not that one, this one, explained why society is crumbling. The concept of bloodvertising ties in with our marketing strategy and sticks to the theme of blood and carnage, which is consistent throughout the Gladiator video game. Yeah, you sure described what the thought process was. Now, the hilarious seer part of this story is that Acclaim, of course, had to pay out of their own pocket to clean the filthy, blood-stained streets. Ah, excellent work. Gladiator got fantastically average reviews, worse sales, and is now relegated to the dustbin of history, although oddly it got a Steam re-release a few years ago. Moving on, do you even realize that it was Acclaim who published the first couple of Burnouts? Yeah, you know, the franchise that EA just let die? Well, for Burnout 2, Point of Impact, Acclaim wanted the UK to know that it was the fastest, most death-defying racing game ever, and they do so by encouraging people to speed in real life, because they'll cover the costs.
He's going over that cliff!
If you got caught speeding and captured via camera on October 11, 2002, you could have just mailed your ticket to Acclaim and they'd foot the bill. Brilliant! You don't have to buy Burnout or anything. That's just the promotion. That was it. Marketing necromancer Sean White once again chimed in with, Acclaim does not condone speeding, but we want to ease the financial pain associated with it. Taking the side of people who enjoy driving fast, it therefore seemed quite logical to offer those people caught by camera something that would make them feel better about it. You know, oddly enough, the United Kingdom Department of Transport disagreed. What? If they want to foot what is likely to be a hefty bill, that is their choice. But we cannot condone what so obviously encourages people to do dangerous things, spokesman said. Basically, they're encouraging people to speed and to break the law. I just hope for their sakes that no one ends up hitting a child. Jesus! This is, again, a sensationalist way to promote a game without actually promoting the game. Any chowderhead can just speed, have their ticket paid off by Acclaim, and not give a rat's ass about Burnout, which is a shame, because Point of Impact was a real filibuster. Putting the games front and center wasn't really Acclaim's style. It was more about the in-your-face, over-the-top stunts and shock value, and not about the video games. Bunch of flashy gits, the lot of them. Their last, and maybe most infamous of blunders, however, was when they were promoting the release of Shadow Man's Second Coming, the PS2 exclusive sequel to the original game. Instead of advertising via blood or bones or something, Acclaim wanted to advertise on death itself, with small billboards placed on actual gravestones that would show Shadow Man's release date. Classless clown Sean White once again tried to justify this. The concept of what we're calling deadvertising is entirely consistent with the theme of Shadow Man's second coming and provides us with a permanent presence for our advertising. Content and context are two important principles of marketing Shadow Man. Acclaim would compensate any family willing to sell this advertising space to them, with a spokesman clarifying that this offer might particularly interest poorer families, as this subsidy could go to burial costs and give their loved one a good send-off. Shadow Man 2 is a journey to the dead side. It's a dark, gory type of game, and we thought it was appropriate to raise advertising to a new level. Okay, give me a second here. I guess if there's a dead family member who really liked, say, Halo 2, he might be into this. But who the hell would ever say, if I die, make sure to let everyone know how fucking dope I think Shadow Man 2 is gonna be? That dead guy was wrong. As you can expect, everyone hated this. When Matthew Carrington, chairman of the Outdoor Advertising Association, said, it is illegal to put any advertising up outdoors without planning permission, and of course there could be issues of desecration. Advertising in graveyards is clearly objectionable, but I wasn't surprised, since advertising firms are always trying to up the ante in shock value, but it's unlikely this will ever get approved. The Church of England also simply stated, there is enough fuss with plastic flowers in churchyards. There is no way we will allow this. And they never did. Despite grabbing headlines for one day, it did little to help Shadow Man 2, which is far less successful than the first entry and thus killed the franchise. Acclaim was never the smartest or biggest dog in the yard. They were certainly, for a time though, the loudest, shouting and barking to anyone who would listen, still employing outdated or never-in-dated marketing tactics to make up for their obvious lack of fiscal responsibility and creativity. They sold off most of their assets and franchises in 2004 and were closed that same year. And thus, the case of the moronic marketing maestros is closed. If you'd like to suggest another case file I can take a look at, let me know in the comments below or check out the Flophouse VIP Patreon offices to officially nominate a particularly juicy story. See you next time, fellow gumshoes, on the Flophouse Files. You know the old song, the times they are a-changin', and on this episode of the Flophouse Files, they sure did for the barely existing subgenre known as car combat. A bunch of vehicles firing in all directions with the last car still running being crowned the winner. The advent of new-fangled 3D consoles like the PlayStation, coupled with Sony Computer Entertainment's louder, more in-your-face marketing campaign, a sudden glut of games took the wholesome tradition of the leisurely Sunday drive into
Sweet Tooth is back in Twisted Metal 3 with enough weapons to make any angry driver happy.
This came to a head in 1995 with single-track's Twisted Metal. Now, it wasn't just a racer with a flashy name. In fact, it wasn't a racer at all. But it made an impact as it went on to birth a whole new type of game. Well, it kind of. Well, not really. But why did this all happen? Why did such a hot new idea crash and burn so fast? And where are car combat games nowadays? Well, it's a complex story filled with spills, chills, and thrills. This is the case of the vanishing vehicular violence. Now, the idea of strapping weapons onto cars didn't start with Twisted Metal, because in previous generations, you could use a whole arsenal in rock and roll racing, working someone over with a pool cue in Road Rash, or of course, exploding Limburger and Biker Mice from Mars. That aside, there was always a racing element to said games, but when Destruction Derby released in October of 1995 on the PlayStation and PC, it emphasized, don't be shocked, destruction, in lieu of beating opponents to the checkered flag. But just 1 month later, Twisted Metal would also hit the PlayStation and took this idea even further, essentially presenting a fighting game. Over-the-top fantasy characters, dark moody backgrounds, a narrative focusing on a shady villain hosting a tournament, with all comers willing to do anything and everything to win. Twisted Metal was living life in the fast lane on Sony's new machine, selling well over 1 million copies, which of course had all other competitors racing to take that crown. You had things like Carmageddon, Vigilante 8, Interstate 76, Turn Signal 420, and many, many others. It seemed like this was going to be the hot new genre, like the first-person shooter was just a few years earlier. However, one major thing occurred that many gamers might not have been aware of. Behind the scenes, Twisted Metal was caught in between a custody battle between SingleTrack, the developer of the series, and Sony Computer Entertainment, the publisher. Once Twisted Metal 2 released and was an even bigger smash, as well as delivering another hit with the Jet Moto series, SingleTrack accused Sony of withholding payments they were owed due to the game's phenomenal success. Sony disagreed, and the two companies parted ways. Since the franchise was owned by the publishing giant, however, they instead pushed forward with both Twisted Metal 3 and 4 with their own internal studio, 989 at the helm. The reception to these two sequels wasn't especially enthusiastic, with two factors working against them. 989 were not given much time to develop either game, and were also not given access to any assets or code from Twisted Metal 1 and 2, something SingleTrack wholly owned, leaving 989 at a distinct disadvantage in trying to emulate the look and feel of the franchise. During all this, car combat clones kept coming out, and those clones were even getting their own sequels, while SingleTrack decided to start all over again and shacked up with GT Interactive for a multi-game deal. First was Critical Depth, an underwater take on Twisted Metal, which garnered average reviews, so they therefore immediately followed up that with Rogue Trip Vacation 2012, which even had a loud and proud "From the creators of Twisted Metal" sticker right on the jewel case, which only mystified ignorant players who had no idea of the split between Sony and single track. While Rogue Trip certainly tried some new things within the genre, its name and the weaker marketing reach of GT Interactive resulted in the game being largely ignored by the public, not even approaching the sales of the then current Twisted Metals. Single track then hit hard times, baby, before one final dying fart escaped their asses, that being Animorphs. They closed their doors in 2000. Twisted Metal 3 and 4, however, while still selling quite well, was on a downward trend, and in 2001, 989 had the franchise taken away from them, with the keys being handed to some familiar faces. Incognito Entertainment was formed by former members of Single Track around 1999, after the completion of Rogue Trip, and made a deal with Sony to continue twisting the metal with two distinct games in 2001. The first being something maybe nobody wanted: Twisted Metal Small Brawl, a more kid-friendly spin on the source material for the PlayStation 1 for some reason. While Sony's aging console still had a big install base, why anyone thought this was a good idea is just, I don't know. It received, as you can expect, mixed reviews. That same year, they released the complete total opposite, this time on the PlayStation 2 with Twisted Metal Black. This was something of a reboot to the series, with a far darker, almost gothic aesthetic, eschewing the colorful roots of the series. This was also a homecoming for Twisted Metal creators David Jaffe and Scott Campbell, who hadn't touched the franchise since the second game. During those years off, between Twisted Metal 4 and Twisted Metal Black, no other franchise came up to fill the void, and by the time Black had come out, things were already on a downturn because 2001 was an important year just for something else. Car combat was fast being left in the dust for another marriage between vehicles and violence, that being the open world sandbox, heralded by GTA 3. Luxoflux, makers of Vigilante 8, started off the millennium with 2000's forgettable Star Wars Demolition, but quickly made a hard left, ditching car combat altogether for True Crime Streets of LA, just 2 years after Black had released. And by this time, the genre was already petering out with some licensed Drek that was slow on the uptake, but there's no need to name names here. WWE, crush heart!
The Undertaker now has control of the Twisty Rockets.
The Twisted Metal franchise, the bedrock of car combat, the Street Fighter of the genre, proved to be incredibly inconsistent, as it was a bit unclear of what direction Incognito or Sony wanted to take it. This couldn't be further exemplified by 2005's PSP exclusive Twisted Metal Head-On, which ran back the rebooted universe established by Black and was instead considered a direct sequel to 2, ignoring the events of 3 and 4. This is a common practice nowadays, but might have been a touch confusing 14 years ago. Following Head On, however, in another baffling move, Incognito was planning to then make a sequel to Black, going back to that universe with Twisted Metal Harbor City. Work got underway, but then several prominent team members up and left the project mid-development. This effectively killed Incognito, the remaining staff joining David Jaffe at his new studio, Eat, Sleep, Play, which he founded after directing God of War. What's more confusing about all of this is that 3 years later, in 2008, a port of Head On was announced for the PlayStation 3, called Twisted Metal Head On Extra Twisted Edition. This version was handled by Eat, Sleep, Play, shoehorning in the levels that were initially made for Harbor City, and this must be a mistake. It says this was on the PS2, not the PS3, the console that had already been out for 3 years. Yes, for reasons I can't ascertain, Twisted Metal was again delegated to an older, less capable machine, while sandbox games were continually blowing up on next-gen machines. There were now only a handful of titles that were still standard bearers for the genre, things like Full Auto, Red Faction Battlegrounds, and Blood Drive, none of which were strong enough to carry things forward. That's not to say Sony wasn't pushing car-based games. games, they just weren't pushing Twisted Metal, but instead things like MotorStorm on the PS3. In fact, MotorStorm was so big at that time that its various sequels and spin-offs would wind up influencing or even outright canceling Twisted Metal pitches. One such version, pitched by Eat Sleep Play, was dubbed Twisted Metal Apocalypse, which, as you can imagine, revolved around a more end-of-the-world type scenario. However, MotorStorm Apocalypse put the kibosh on that, forcing Eat Sleep Play to go back to the proverbial drawing board. Twisted Metal Revolution was then pitched, which was a hip-hop urban flavored take on the franchise, which Sony passed on. We can consider this time frame to be similar to the dark ages of fighting games, as the mid to late 2000s were rough to a lot of established series and genres. Street Fighter releases had all but dried up, but a few remaining games were holding things down, things like Tekken, Mortal Kombat, and yeah, even Dead or Alive. But unlike fighting games, car combat lacked these strong contenders. It took until 2012 for the franchise to finally make its return with Twisted Metal, another reboot, this time with David Jaffe at the wheel. This game, however, had its own unique set of problems. It was originally pitched and greenlit as a digital-only multiplayer-focused budget title until Sony marketing asked for single-player content to be added, even though it wasn't initially in the plan. Following that, the game suddenly switched from a smaller digital-only release to a full-boxed game, something that again, Eat Sleep Play hadn't prepared for. They were a very small company, so with slapdash story content added in, a limited roster of characters, and the generally smaller scale of everything, Twisted Metal failed to make any waves in the current marketplace, either in sales or reviews. Eat Sleep Play lingered on for a few more years, making smelly iOS time wasters until they closed in 2016, and thus marked the last game ever released under the Twisted Metal banner. This complete mishandling of this legendary franchise, the lack of worthy successors to the throne, and the advent and exploding popularity of sandbox games are all contributing factors to the death of car combat. That being said, there are still little specks of its DNA that live on. As odd as it first may seem, Rocket League takes those same concepts and does something wholly unique with them, but obviously in a far less violent way. Racing games themselves still have some combative elements, with games like Grip, Combat Racing, Gas Guzzlers, or the short-lived Onrush, but nothing like Twisted Metal survives to this day, and in fact, unless my files are incomplete, none of the developers who made car combat in the 90s and early 2000s still exist themselves, except maybe the developer of the Interstate franchise, which was, yeah, they're still alive, obviously. It's a case of too many games being released too quickly, glacial innovation, and the encroaching popularity of competitive genres. Even Twisted Metal itself, in its last bid to recapture its glory days, failed to do so. Maybe if it had been given the budget and time to make a better impression on the PS3, or was positioned to be a big Vita title, things could have been different. But sometimes you can't dwell on the past, and you need to look forward to the crater-filled, shell-casing covered open highway of the future. And with that, the case of the vanishing vehicular violence is closed. Know of any other stories I can track down? Jot down some notes in the comments below, or head on over to the Flophouse VIP HQ to nominate a case file. Catch you next time, fellow gumshoes, on the Flophouse Files. The 70s and 80s were some of the most drab, mundane, and uneventful decades in the history of time, and this has been an undisputable fact since ever. Just nothing really happened. Then Fred Durst came along, a blue-eyed, foul-mouthed, aspiring little skater boy from North Carolina who had aspirations to conquer the music world. And he did. Don't let any other facts tell you otherwise. He did so through the magical and ageless melodies of Limp Bizkit, who released their first album in 1997. And the rest, as they say, is history. Greasy, rap rock, Adidas, new era ball cap, weird face, painted, covered history. Mr. Durst would eventually go on to having his own label, direct music videos, and motion pictures. But for the purpose of this story we'll be investigating today, we'll be focusing on his surprising amount of appearances in video games. And when I say surprising, I mean more than one, which is higher than the average musical artist by, like, a lot. But why did this happen? How did this happen? And why did this happen? I already asked that part. This is the case of the cursed thirst of Durst. In the late 90s and early 2000s, there were a lot of things that were in, and if you wanted to be with it,
I used to be with it, but then they changed what it was.
You needed to be enthusiastic about at least two of them. These cultural milestones ran the gamut from Chef Boyardee's overstuffed extreme ravioli, Razor scooters, rap rock, and finally the discerning connoisseur's choice, professional wrestling. Video games, always cool and popular, were at their zenith in terms of adapting said wrestling programs, giving the consumer almost too many choices to grapple with. One such consumer was our boy Fred. Now, one of these premier series of video games was the SmackDown series, which had two incredible entries on the PlayStation 1 with Know Your Role absolutely maxing out the hardware. The developers of the game, Ukes, were already preparing for their big PS2 follow-up with Just Bring It, an entry that had better graphics and an updated roster and not too many other fundamental changes. But having been released only a year after the last game, it was understandable. What was less understandable was the inclusion of a secret unlockable character. Excuse me for my lack of dramatics, but yes, it was Fred Durst. Now your first question is arguably, of course, why? Well, secret characters were never a taboo in wrestling games. You get things like managers, legends, mascots, and the like, and if you're very terrible, i.e. Nitro or Thunder, you get a bunch of made-up moronic malarkey.
What the? Who the? What the hell is a sting?
Going back to the WWF, something important happened in the year 2000, specifically at the Armageddon pay-per-view. No, it wasn't that Chris Jericho beat Kane, or that Kurt Angle beat everybody, and it certainly wasn't the fact that the Wonder Boys, Steven Regal and Hardcore Holly, tore the house down. No, it was because The Undertaker had changed theme songs, going from Kid Rock's American Badass to Limp Bizkit's Rollin'. A big upgrade, if you ask me. The Big Undie proceeded to wheel out on his push bike to Rollin', open parenthesis air raid vehicle close parenthesis, well into 2002. However, Just Bring It would be the first WWF game that would need to get the license to this new song to stay up to date, something incredibly important in the ever-changing landscape of professional wrestling. Approval for licensed content needs to be sought out for other forms of media, so Fred Durst was claimed to have said, sure. Or, more likely,
alright, partner. Keep on rolling, baby. You know what time it is.
But he did have one other caveat. He would need to be inserted into the game itself as a fully playable character, his own moveset, entrance, the whole 9 yards.
Well, this man doesn't have a Limp Bizkit, I can guarantee you. He's got more testicular fortitude than maybe anybody in this bitch.
Now, any number of musical acts could charge even more for their song to be used, or be a huge penis for simply just saying no. But Fred Durst was Fred Durst, holding the song hostage not for money, but to simply have his likeness in a wrestling video game. As we can see in this footage, no expense was spared. Freddie D even gets a special dual intro if he teams up with The Undertaker in a tag match. Now, what's a bit odder is the method in which to unlock him. 1. you must select a slobber knocker match. 2, you must use The Undertaker. 3, you must defeat 20 opponents in a row. If you've managed to do that, you can truly say you did it all for the nookie. Now, some question whether or not love can bloom on the battlefield, but it certainly can in a wrestling ring. This kicked off the Limp and McMahon connection, because in 2001, the WWF hosted their biggest WrestleMania at that point, and arguably their best. WrestleMania X7 or just 17, it's X7, that's far more 2000s era appropriate. To hype up the big stunning Steve Austin versus Rock the Dwayne Johnson match, WWF made an anime music video, which is an amazingly potent nuclear bomb of new millennium style, as it used the legendary track, My Way. Things kept on rolling, because the very next year, Fred raised his red little head in the Xbox exclusive WWF Raw, which was made by the little-known Anchor Entertainment. Wait, what have they developed before? Yeah. Oh. Anyway, you might not have heard of this one, mostly because it was quite poor, as is Fred's intro, as we are seeing. No lowrider, no over-the-top mannerisms that would make Buff Bagwell blush, no special dual entrance. I guess since Undertaker was still using Rollin' as his theme, the WWF were contractually obligated to keep putting Fred in their games, I guess? Well, to unlock him, since there was no slobber knocker match in this game, it's a much more straightforward affair. Win every single championship belt. Yes, even the European Championship. Yeah, that's it. So it's plain to see, this is a much more subdued and low-key appearance. And speaking of low, wow, Fred sure is crouching down there. You okay, sir? Sir! Yeah! Now, what is not exactly clear is why only these two WWF games got a special appearance by the Limp Bizkit frontman and not the bevy of other grappling games released in the same time frame. Why not WrestleMania X8 for the GameCube? That was released before Raw and even has Rollin' featured as The Undertaker's theme. Well, what's wrong with the GameCube, Fred? Are you a console fanboy? Yeah! And hell, Road to WrestleMania on the GBA came out in Limp Bizkit's heyday. Imagine a little Natsume-crafted sprite of Fred Durst. Wow, life could be worse, but it could be a lot better too. Oh, wait. Hold up! That might be Fred in the audience. I think. Yeah, that's him. Confirmed. Leaving the WWF behind us, we are now moving on to our final and perhaps most baffling aspect of this case. In 2004, a year where there were no Limp Bizkit things to advertise, and admittedly their star had fallen somewhat, there was one more game Fred Durst's iconic cap was thrown into: the grimy, blood-stained floors of Fight Club for the PS2 and Xbox. Yes, for those that have had their memory lobe of their brain removed, there was a Fight Club game. You know, Fight Club, the movie that said to throw away your material possessions and to not devote your lives to marketing corporations? Yeah, buy this video game! Lacking all the social and economic commentary of the film, and especially ignoring the number of other themes the novel tackled, Fight Club is an incredibly basic fighting game featuring an all-star cast, including Bob, Angelface, Irvin, Mechanic, Ricky, Lou, Raymond, and of course, Fred. Abraham Lincoln was also an unlockable character, which, if you're familiar with Fight Club, makes sense in a not making sense sort of way. Fred Durst, however, is way more mysterious. Our first clue, according to the essential chocolate starfish slapper living it up.
Pay me no mind. I seen the Fight Club about 28 times.
That's all we have to go on. Fred Durst really likes Fight Club and happens to be quite chummy with David Fincher, the movie's director. And that's it. That's not it. In normal circumstances, this might have been a lot more difficult for Freddy to pull off, but the path to being a playable character in this game was actually surprisingly clear. All of Limp Bizkit's albums up to that point were put out by Interscope Records, a subsidiary of the Universal Music Group, which you might know best from ruining thousands of YouTube videos. Fred was promoted to Senior Vice President of Interscope in 1999. Why is this important? Well, because Fight Club was distributed and published by Vivendi Universal, which we can assume helped grease the wheels to grant him his wish. This game also requires the least commitment to unlock the King of Rap Rock, as all you have to do is clear the story mode once, which, while simple, is probably a feat many people have probably never done, as it requires you to 1. Buy Fight Club, and 2. Play Fight Club. Much like the rest of the roster, Fred doesn't have anything unique setting him apart. His range is rather limited and possesses a mundane set of moves and attacks. This is another case of Fred simply wanting to be in a game without really caring if it was good or not. So it's rather a limp entry to go out on, I'm sorry. And so with that, we have run through the digital career of Mr. Durst throughout a variety of video games. Released video games, that is. Because now it's time for a Brucey bonus. There is one more title he was slated to feature in, a game that was even formally announced but never made it to market, and most unfortunately, one that doesn't have any surviving media. Jonathan Davis, the frontman for Silent Hill and Haze enthusiasts Korn, let the world know that Pop Scars would be released on the PlayStation 2 sometime in 2005. It was going to be a straight-up one-on-one fighter that would feature Fred Durst, other members of Korn, Aaron Lewis of Staind, and Marilyn Manson. Davis claimed that Mary J. Blige and other artists from across the musical spectrum would also be included, with character design handled by comic book artist Marty Edmond. In terms of direction, American McGee was said to be heading up the project and would feature outlandish stages that would cater to that particular fighter's personality. So, most likely, Durst World would feature bouncing cars, skate ramps, and oodles of female backup dancers cosplaying as him. The stages would also have several obstacles that, well, let's just let Mr. Davis explain. There's going to be different traps and things that can really just eat them up. It's going to be gory, and it's going to be good. Okay, Pop Scars most likely became a thing to capitalize on the success of the Def Jam series, as Fight for New York had just released around the time of the reveal. But Davis seemed to ascertain that the game was created because... I'm really excited about it because we spend most of our time gaming. It's music and games, that's my escape. I love it. Despite said excitement, the game was then unceremoniously cancelled, with Davis explaining to Kerrang! In 2019, it was one of the gaming companies, and they had to pull out because they had to pull away entire teams to work on other games. It just didn't happen, but I really liked it. So yes, it just didn't happen, but Jonathan Davis really liked it, and the world was denied an anthology of Fred Durst video gamedom rather than just a trilogy. It seemed, despite the oddness of it all, Fred Durst was controlling all the cards at the time these games were released, either through contract negotiations with the WWE, using his contacts within the music industry, or just trying to help a pal make weird fighting game fanfiction. What would you do if you're in a position of similar power? Ask for more money or more of your tracks be included in said game? Maybe ask for a featuring Fred Durst from the Limp Bizkit series sticker on the front? No, Fred simply wanted to play video games with himself in them, a fantasy most others can only dream about, but he did it. 3.5 times. Now, while Limp Bizkit haven't released a new album in almost a decade, Fred has kept himself busy with other projects.
Hey, you ever heard of Bigfoot? Bigfoot is the first real monster truck. They got others, but Bigfoot's the first. I'd love to be the first at something.
This was a story of a man who simply loved video games so much that he was able to digitally insert himself into them through the sheer power of will and money too. That was actually the important part. So with that, the case of the cursed thirst of Durst is closed. Know of any other cases I can take a look at? Scream your suggestions in the comments below, or shred a solo over at the Flophouse VIP Patreon to officially throw a file onto my desk. We'll see you next time, fellow gumshoes, on the Flophouse Files. In one of our past case files, we delved into the grimy underbelly of lost and forgotten fighting games from perennial Flophouse Files suspect, Midway Entertainment. Today, another case has slid across my desk from my informant, Mick Shork, who has tasked me with investigating a publisher that forgets about their fighting games more than anyone. Sega, whose list of MIA franchises is incredibly long and incredibly embarrassing. What I'll be doing specifically is getting to the truth of the matter regarding one of these franchises, and the rumor that Sega self-sabotaged it for absolutely no reason at all, which is something Sega has done in the past. It's a shocking tale of mysterious mismanagement that I like to call the case of the not-so-eternal champions. These things start, like most fighting game stories do, with the marginal success of something called Fighting the Street 2. Many other publishers, inspired by the idea of making tons of cash, set to work trying to carve out their own slice of the lucrative fighting game pie. Sega, though, decided to do this on two very different fronts. Sega of Japan would focus on the arcade scene and the fancy schmancy 3D polygons of Virtua Fighter, headed up by their golden goose, Yu Suzuki. Meanwhile, Sega of America, who worked very independently from Japan at that time, decided to push forward a fighting game of their own, and the resident Street Fighter II office champion, Michael Landham, was more than ready to accept this job that he was passed over for. Instead, senior producer Scott Burfield was given that job instead, and drafted up a few ideas before he suddenly decided to quit Sega altogether. Thus, fate smiled and then turned her head towards Michael Landham once again, and his dream job of creating a fighting game was now his, because the last one he worked on, could have gone better.
Welcome to the Fight Palace.
Now, when it came to the design work that had been started on this project, Michael, well, he threw out pretty much everything, except for, wait, I have it in the file here. The one thing he kept was the character of Shadow Yamato. For obvious reasons. Check out those gams! From that point forward, Michael went hard on creating elaborate backstories for each character and drafted up a rough 3-arc story treatment, which saw a mystical being known as the Eternal Champion giving the gift of life to a number of damned souls who had met an untimely end. The fighters included the aforementioned Shadow Yamato, Larson, Midnight, Blade, no, not that Blade, but they look alike, whatever, Jetta, Trident, Slash, Xavier, and Rax. Not only did each warrior have detailed histories, but Michael wanted as many of their special moves and attacks to be based on some semblance of real martial arts. Also, the game's button layout was even specifically designed to take advantage of the 6-button Genesis pad, as well as with one of the most dustbin-destined peripherals of all time, the Activator.
What a piece of shit.
Sega of America was indeed pulling out all the stops. Now, while Eternal Champion sought to unseat Street Fighter II, it also had its eye firmly set on Mortal Kombat as well, which is pretty evident by this over-the-top and poorly aged comic book advertisement. In a full-force attack, Blade bumbles Slash in China. Look at these warriors, they're huge! A wimp like Blanca wouldn't stand a chance. To prepare for Eternal Champions, use Street Fighter II as your training wheels. The battle room, where the room itself can sap your strength. Here, Jedha does a little sapping of her own with a double-fisted air dive on Shadow. Hey, Johnny Cage, scared you'll get whipped by a girl? It tackled Mortal Kombat even more directly by adding a helping of good old over-the-top ultra-violence. While characters couldn't perform individual fatalities, each stage had their own finisher, with some being particularly detailed and gruesomely memorable. Eternal Champions also featured a training room with extensive options, including damaging traps and various other effects. While the combat mostly stayed true to the one-on-one fighting formula, EC also changed things up by introducing a chi system, which would govern the frequency you could throw out special moves. This gauge was affected by taunts and other actions, so while it was very clear that marketing-wise, Eternal Champions was taking cheap shots at its competitors, it was anything but a carbon copy. Because of that, and the fact it was a first-party Sega release, Eternal Champions was a success, and while exact sales numbers are not known, it appeared on several labels heralding said success, including Sega's Platinum Collection. Additionally, the game was even able to stir up some merchandise, such as appearing in the official Sonic the Hedgehog comic book, and eventually got its own dedicated special issue. There were even early talks of Eternal Champions being adapted into a Saturday morning cartoon, as was the style at the time. However, the game released in late 1993, which just so happened to be the same year Virtua Fighter also hit the arcade beat, and this left Sega of Japan in a bit of a pickle, or more accurately, a pickle of their own creation. Yu Suzuki was one of their star creators, and thus his baby, Virtua Fighter, needed all the attention, especially since no publisher, outside SNK, had more than one successful fighting game franchise in 1993. Sega felt the sales and popularity of one game was hurting the other. Thus, despite EC's success, it was decided that instead of receiving a full-fledged sequel, it would be relegated to a Sega CD exclusive upgrade with a few added characters, backgrounds, and gameplay tweaks. Eternal Champions, Challenge from the Dark Side, was Michael Landham and his team making the best out of an unideal situation, cramming the game with as much as they possibly could. They utilized the CD medium for fancy CGI Cinekills, which showed the Eternal Champion dusting a particular character in spectacular fashion. Well, as spectacular as you can be by grainy reboot Season 1 standards. Now, that didn't mean that the game was a slouch visually in some other areas, because while the Sega CD was notorious for its limited color display, which is why many of its games had a gross, washed-out kind of look, Challenge from the Dark Side was able to push 256 colors on screen at once, leading to one of the better-looking games on the terrible add-on. Unique fatalities called Vendettas were also added to each character's arsenal, with this cast of newcomers including Raven, Dawson McShane, Ramses III, Riptide, Blast, Chin, as well as the Eternal Champion and the Dark Champion. Furthermore, there were also a number of bonus parody characters, including Hooters, Yappy, Crispy, Zuni, Slither, and of course, Senator. All the elaborate stage overkills were back in full force, with some pushing the limits of pixelated punishment. All in all, while it's seen as a very big improvement on the first game, it being a Sega CD exclusive limited its appeal and saw far fewer sales. Still though, Michael's team at Sega of America were given small opportunities to expand the franchise with spin-off projects, including the nice-looking but dreadfully plain Expert starring Shadow Yamamoto, and the very obscure Game Gear exclusive Chicago Syndicate, which showcased Larson in a leading role. However, since these spin-offs released at the very end of both machines' lifespans, they again saw very little popularity. Since the sales of the Genesis original were still so encouraging, Sega of America wanted to push forward with a proper sequel on new hardware, and thus started pre-production. As mentioned earlier, Michael Landham had written 20 pages of lore, with Eternal Champions, the final chapter, being the final chapter. Meanwhile, Sega of Japan were getting fustigated as Virtua Fighter was failing to catch on in the home as it did in the arcades. This was due to the competent, but because of the hardware, low-selling Virtua Fighter 32X, as well as the rushed and somewhat underwhelming Saturn version. And with Virtua Fighter 2 still a long way off from getting its home port, Sega were scrambling to try and course-correct these mistakes to make VF a marquee game. So, with 2 botched versions already behind them, desperation really sunk in, which of course resulted in... which is the most desperate thing I've ever seen. Now, while it makes sense to utilize the much bigger install base of the Genesis, this attempt at trying to get Virtua Fighter out there was ill-advised. The later we go into the 90s, Sega of America unfortunately saw much of their autonomy taken away, and their ability to greenlight projects was severely kneecapped, leaving Sega of Japan in charge of those decisions. Michael had an ambitious design for EC The Final Chapter, as it focused on an evil cabal of beings known as the Infernals, who would clash with the original cast with the entire timeline as the prize. The game would have ran with this concept so hard that it would actually factor into the gameplay, with the fluctuating timeline, changing character appearances, movesets, and even story, with 30 possible endings overall. Before full production was given the green light though, Michael was called in by his boss at Sega USA and was handed some bad news. I was devastated. At this point, we had an EC handheld game, choose your own adventure books and comics. There's all this interest to license it out, and then out of the blue, as I'm working on the design, I get asked by Joe Miller to join him on the balcony, his other office. He drops the bomb that despite selling extremely well, EC is dead. Period. The company will focus on Virtua Fighter. This does indeed confirm Sega's intentions, as they felt with only so much money to spend, fighting game fans might only buy Eternal Champions in lieu of Virtua Fighter, and Sega wanted their arcade fighters to be the most prominent. Since Fighting Vipers, Last Bronx, and VF all shared the same Model 2 engine and would have both arcade and home ports, this was deemed as the most cost-effective choice, and with Sega of America's dwindling influence, they were powerless to protest. Discouraged but undaunted, some members of the EC team moved on to Sega Soft's short-lived Heat.net service, which was a website where one could play online games via their personal computer, and NetFighter, a would-be successor to Champions, was one of the available games. Although, like similar online ventures, Heat.net didn't last especially long, with the website shutting down in 2000, with its various titles lost to the Digiverse. Now, as for an actual sequel or follow-up to Eternal Champions, well, that's a bit more complicated. In 2017, Michael Lanham made a public poll to gauge interest in a revival, but since Sega was unwilling to sell the IP, it would need to take on a slightly different form. Eternal's successor, as it was dubbed, had some very early rudimentary work done on it, with these scanned screenshots being the only available media. Unfortunately, the project fizzled out, with Mr. Lanham citing that no publishers expressed any interest in it and ruled out crowdfunding as a viable option. While hindsight is 2020, had Challenge from the Dark Side released on the Genesis, it might have bolstered the franchise up even further and dissuaded Sega of Japan from being so dismissive. It is indeed a strange case of a publisher focusing all their effort on just one series instead of trying to grow two, especially since they appealed to very different types of players. The reason why Midway's other fighting games failed is because they were so similar to Mortal Kombat, but Eternal Champions, with its emphasis on storyline and violence, was the polar opposite of Virtua Fighter's almost non-existent storyline and realistic combat mechanics. But in the end, I guess we'll never truly know if both franchises could have coexisted with each other. So there you have it. Thanks to the additional sleuthing by Mick Shork, we can now call the case of the not-so-eternal champions closed. Know of any other hard-boiled, filth-encrusted stories from the underbelly of the gaming world that you'd like to see in a future case file? Then head on over to the VIP Patreon offices to nominate what you'd like me to investigate next, here on the Flophouse Files. In all my years of poring over old cases, few are as befuddling, mysterious, and most of all embarrassing as the one I'm currently shaking my head at today. Capcom, one of the most prolific and famous video game publishers in the world, has seen their fair share of hard times, but as many know, hard times don't last, but hard people do, and Capcom has weathered many a storm. One of those storms ushered in some cold fronts that blew through the halls of the Osaka-based company in the early 2000s, which, innocently enough, started with a string of surprising announcements that would leave long-lasting effects. See, unlike many of their competitors, Capcom was hitting their stride in the move to next-gen consoles and 3D game development, bolstered by big franchises like Resident Evil, Onimusha, and Devil May Cry. These series were primarily being handled by Production Studio 4, a cabal of their most respected young talent, comprised of experienced visionaries, disciplined producers, and of course, a few rebels. These were the people who opened up a new chapter for Capcom, away from the scan lines and quarter munching of the arcades, and into console-exclusive, darker titles molded after, yes, Resident Evil. And that word there, exclusive, is kind of the whole linchpin of all this, because in late 2002, Capcom would announce to the world that their high-rolling creators were unleashing a new generation of titles and characters that, according to them, would reinvigorate the gaming industry. It was doing fine, and all through the cubic power of Nintendo's newest machine. They did no such thing. This is a case I like to call the fantabulous failure of Capcom 5. To get to the bottom of this, we're going to need to roll it back a bit all the way to the salty, dusty year of 1996. Despite many of Capcom's biggest successes coming from the slot of the good old Super Nintendocom, the decision that its successor, the Nintendo 64, would drop the CD medium altogether was incredibly boneheaded. Doing this cost them the support of many of their former chums, including Capcom, who only put out 3 titles on the machine. Although, gotta give Angel Studios credit for cramming good old RE2 on there.
What are you doing here?
My name's Leon. I'm with the RP.
Whew. Sorry about that, babe.
Weirdly enough, though, there was lots of love for the Game Boy Color, but for Nintendo's home console division, there certainly were some bridges that needed to be rebuilt. It was around this time that Shinji Mikami, the head of Production Studio 4, was sniffing out partnerships that would play host to his group's upcoming titles. Of the big 3 options, Sony wasn't really in the running. Mikami had some beef with them, so they had an audience with Microsoft first, who just so happened to be desperately seeking out any and all Japanese creators to make content for the Xbox, or, as it was known in Japan, the thing that takes up 70% of all the square footage in our house. When he asked Microsoft representatives what was behind the company's philosophy and their game-making process, they were caught off guard and simply stammered and gave a weak reply. Mikami then pondered for a second, bowed slightly, and left the room, vanishing into the night. One of the Microsoft bigwigs, Kevin Bacchus, was present, and since he didn't speak a lick of Japanese, asked what the hell just happened. Once the Japanese interpreters explained, raucous Bacchus was mortified, as he would have given a very clear, rehearsed answer. By the time Microsoft got back into touch with Capcom to schedule another meeting, though, Mikami was being coddled in the warm, loving bosom of Nintendo. Oh, but don't feel too bad, Microsoft. Capcom is more than willing to give you your own top-notch exclusive survival horror epic. This Resident Evil switcheroo was made public in September of 2001, just a month shy of the GameCube actually launching. It would encompass the remake, Zero, and, well, you know the rest. This partnership was going well, and with Mikami being so impressed by the nuts and bolts of the GameCube that a follow-up announcement was set for November of 2002 that would show just how much support Capcom was willing to throw Nintendo's way. A grand presentation at the lavish and exclusive Velfair Club in the swinging district of Roppongi. I never know how to pronounce this, and people always give me shit. Roppongi. Okay. Up in the swinging district of Roppongi was scheduled, with a glut of Japanese and foreign press in attendance, their lips parched and their keyboards quivering for whatever this was going to be. Capcom then trotted out their superstars like show ponies, dressed up in flashy jackets and shiny pants. For all intents and purposes, they were rock stars. Each one took to the stage to present the project they were working on, although very little palpable info was revealed. First up was the already known but at that point mysterious Resident Evil 4, which at this point was at the airship version, I guess, produced by Hiroyuki Kobayashi and directed by Hiroshi Shibata. It would release in the near future of 2000X. I'm not yanking your Johnson, it actually said that. Capcom then rolled out 4 brand new games, with Shinji Mikami, the Godfather, overseeing them all. The first title was the one he had the biggest hand in, though, which was PN03, or Project Number 3. A futuristic third-person shoot-'em-up with a squeaky clean art style and a shapely doll by the name of Vanessa Z. Schneider. While interesting, this was certainly a stark contrast compared to what Capcom had been producing for the last 2 years. The appropriately named Dead Phoenix was next, a gorgeous-looking flight-based fantasy action shooter that featured an unnamed hero blasting through an unnamed world. It was to be directed by one Hiroki Kato, the director of Code Veronica, and of all the titles shown at the event, elicited the strongest reactions from the crowd. Following that, we saw the little devil himself, Hideki Kamiya, dressed to the nines in his finest leather getup, introducing Beautiful Joe, the one of the 4 new games that seemed most in line with Capcom's history, a colorful beat-em-up action game that leaned into Japanese superheroes and Fred Durst. Then finally, amongst a throng of unique titles came the most unique of them all, Killer 7, made not by Production Studio 4, but rather Grasshopper Manufacture, and directed by Suda51, who of course came out dressed as a member of the Killer 7 Masked Smith, before dispelling with a disguise and presenting his neo-noir FPS third-person shooter action-adventure hybrid. Now, revealing 4 brand new franchises from one company in one single event is rare nowadays, since there is such a strong reliance on sequels and remasters, so you can imagine the ripple effect this all had. Even more ludicrously, all the titles were slated to be released the following year, save for RE4. For that, you'll just have to wait until X, I guess. All of this was a bit of a shock, as the whole event went down with little warning in Japan, with much of the Western world catching some Z's when it was live. But almost as important as the games themselves was how murky some of the messaging was. Capcom had opened up the presentation by saying, "We believe that the regression of excitement is solely the fault of the responsibility of we creators. By the same token, we believe it is also our mission and responsibility to create something that is worth seeing for the user. In a market that has become prosaic with character-dependent games and sequel games, we would like to take this opportunity to announce 5 new and exciting games for GameCube." At no point were any other machines mentioned. In fact, on Capcom's website, which recapped the event, it said, crystal clear and with no error in translation, "For the growth of the gaming industry. For GameCube." Now, as simple as that was, it would of course need to be confirmed, reconfirmed, and then confirmed again by various media outlets. Capcom was bombarded by questions for days and weeks following the announcement, asking for clarification if these titles were indeed GameCube exclusives, which was seen as a bit of a mistake, as the PS2 wasn't only performing way better as a console, but Capcom games were making some serious dosh. Coupled with that, the previous Resident Evil exclusivity deal really made it seem like Capcom was simply doubling down here, very much setting the stage for that assumption. Fortunately, however, an official memo was eventually sent to the press, straight from Capcom themselves, and dispelled all the confusion with a frank, no BS statement that said, all of the 5 titles announced on November 14th in Japan are for the GameCube only. Well, I'd say that's as concrete as a pair of galoshes, so let's move on. Now, project number 3 was, January 2003, at a Gamers Day event in the city of Sin, Las Vegas, Nevada, almost 2 months after the initial unveiling, Capcom in a squeaky, almost terrified voice clarified that all games, save for RE4, were not in fact GameCube exclusive at all, but instead could very well see or not see ports in the future. This revelation, or by Capcom standards revelatons, occurring in an early 2000s online environment was tantamount to heretical betrayal. Just imagine nowadays if Capcom announced that a new Dead Rising was going to be exclusive to the Xbox, and then later said, oh, did we say exclusive? What we meant was, okay, bad example, but you get my point. A promise of exclusivity is the fuel in which powers the raging war machine that is fanboyism, so assuredly the bodies were stacked high on IGN Insider forums that day. Now, while this is a disastrous PR nightmare, and the fact this vague statement exclusivity lasted an ice age in internet time, this wasn't the only foible which befell the Capcom 5. With the next one being the fact that Project Number 3 was the first of them to hit store shelves, and had the "from the creator of Resident Evil" marketing angle slapped onto it. Being the standard bearer for this huge Capcom Nintendo blood ritual was an unfair expectation to be placed on Vanessa's shoulders. This was not a trendy, epic third-person action adventure, but rather a simplistic, almost arcade-style shooter. The slinky dame moved from identical room to identical room, quickly dispatching waves and waves of robots with precise laser shots, while deftly moving out of the way of incoming fire. Clearing each area as fast as you could with as little damage as possible earned you the best ranks, and that's it. It was very light on cinematic story flair or intriguing side quests, no NPCs, no real exploration. It was more like a modern take on Defender or Space Invaders, played from a third-person perspective and featured a mysterious lead who let her blasting do the talking. The game also had a steep learning curve and stiff controls, offering much less in terms of options when stacked up against other action fare releases of the day. So it was clear that this was not the best choice to be the first out of the gate if Capcom wanted to make a good first impression, and perhaps going in hard with all the glitzy press conferences and presenting their creators like they were gods maybe colored expectations, just a tad. It also didn't help matters that Capcom's recently released offerings like Onimusha 2 and the Resident Evil remake were a bit more impressive and in vogue when compared to Mikami's efforts here, despite how unfair that really is. So due to all this, Ms. Schneider was hit by poor reviews and even poorer sales, and has been blacklisted by Capcom ever since. So the Fab Five were sputtering out of the gate, and things only started to get worse from there. When Dead Phoenix failed to show up in Capcom's E3 2003 lineup, an event where both Killer 7 and Beautiful Joe were featured, people were a bit worried. When the game's actual listings started disappearing from all websites and press releases, that's when people got a lot of worried. To this day, Capcom has never given a direct reason for its cancellation. It was essentially never spoken about again. But 2003 was a rocky year in general for the company, as they also also canceled Capcom Fighting All-Stars and Red Dead Revolver, which is originally intended to be a successor to Gunsmoke, or Gun.Smoke. Capcom then relinquished the IP and also the immensely talented Angel Studios, who went on to become Rockstar San Diego. Stepping back a bit and, looking at Capcom's 2003 as a whole, you start to see a whole lot of flim-flam. Devil May Cry 2, Group S Challenge, Dino Crisis 3, Mickey's Hide and Seek. Hey, why wasn't this part of the Capcom 5? Then there's Onimusha Blade Warriors and the Gregory Horror Show, which absolutely no one remembers. They took some chances that year, and many of those chances did not pay off. In one of the few bright spots, Beautiful Joe did release later that summer, and while it garnered great reviews, it didn't exactly set sales charts ablaze, but it did decently enough to bang out a sequel the following year. But at this first sign of trouble, Capcom announced Joe was getting a PS2 port, which touted extra features and a whole new character, something I'm sure lots of GameCube fans appreciated. The entirety of 2004 saw 0 appearances from that initial lineup of the Capcom 5, despite 4 of them all being slated for the previous year. Shinji Mikami, knowing that RE4 could absolutely not fail, took the reins of development and directed it himself, further reiterating until it took on the form we're all familiar with today. However, RE4 had been in and out of development since 1999, and Capcom higher-ups were growing frustrated with mounting costs and low sales of the things coming out of Production Studio 4, and thus started to make their own moves to negate those mounting losses. They mandated that as many titles as possible needed to have multiple ports to mitigate risk, and despite his dislike of the PlayStation brand, Mikami was powerless to protest. Beautiful Joe 2 Henshin a Go-Go'd onto the PS2, followed by Killer 7, but there was still the big one, Resident Evil 4. Now remember, that big survival horror cross GameCube megaton earlier in 2002 wasn't some vague verbal promise, mind you. RE4's exclusivity was a part of an inked written deal twixt Capcom and Nintendo that they simply decided to break. The PS2 version was announced several months before it ever hit the GameCube in early 2005, which was always sort of baffling. Why would any company do this? Just shut the hell up, let the original version sell as much as it can, then months later announce the PS2 version to maximize sales potential. All this did was really hurt Nintendo. Mikami and various other creators within Production Studio 4 were furious, as many of them felt their projects were not being given the marketing muscle that had initially been promised. To appease them, Capcom set up Clover Studios and gave the group more autonomy, which you can hear more about in another case file. Not very long after, though, Mikami and several others eventually had enough of Capcom's practices and decided to leave the company altogether, leaving their bosses little choice but to shut Clover down. What Capcom had learned during this whole messy affair is that they needed more ports, or at the very least, go all in on the winning horse, that being the PlayStation 2, which enjoyed a number of exclusives, much to Mikami's chagrin. The overhyped and underwhelming nature of the Capcom 5 and exclusivity deals, both real and imagined, disrupted a lot of their business in the mid-2000s, with 2003 and 2004 being particularly dire years for the publisher. And even though they corrected their statements on exclusivity, many people still feel that the Capcom 5 was just a bunch of empty promises. Only one title wound up being a GameCube original, and in terms of critical reception and sales, happened to be the worst one. But where are they now? Well, Hideki Kamiya has dug in deep with Platinum Games with more than a few memorable titles to his name. Mikami returned to the concept of an arcade-esque shooter where a white-armored protagonist took on an army of robots in a short but sweet adventure before returning to survival horror once more. Hiroki Kato of Dead Phoenix infamy would also go on to Platinum Games for a spell before exiting the video game industry altogether to become a farmer. Now that's a career change. The one person who seemed to benefit the most out of all this was Goichi Suda. Grasshopper went from an almost complete unknown in Japan and a full unknown in America to being the guys that made Killer 7 once it achieved cult status and appreciation years later. Even though it didn't sell gangbusters and critics were divided on it, it truly was his breakout hit, and Grasshopper is still going strong to this day. What's worse is that this whole debacle made it so Capcom and Nintendo were no longer 100% copacetic with each other, as the GameCube saw less and less support after that, while any games the Wii were graced with usually wound up being cheap ports or spin-offs. There's even a rumor that Nintendo carried that bitterness in their hearts long enough to not even approach Capcom for a guest character slot in Super Smash Bros., despite inviting both Sega and Konami, Capcom's competitors, to the brawl. It took almost a full decade and many ports of RE4 later for the relationship to have finally been mended. It's a tale of misplaced expectations, miscalculations, and most importantly of all, miscommunications. Capcom took those big risks in 2003 and it simply didn't pan out. It was the wrong time with the wrong franchises, and it eventually cost them some of their most valuable talent. It very much seemed that the creators of these games were giving it their all, but the business side of Capcom started to get cold feet very quickly, and immediately started backpedaling and second-guessing just about every other decision. It's what actually pushed the company, later led by Inafune, to invest in a big Western push, as was the style at the time. At the very least, this is all certainly an event that marketing executives of today and the future can look towards and say, "Whoa, damn, yeah, let's not do that." And thus, the case of the fantabulous failure of the Capcom 5 is closed. If you'd like to suggest another seedy tale from the underbelly of the gaming industry, just drop a comment in the video below or walk into the offices of the Flophouse VIP Patreon to officially nominate the subject of your choosing. Until then, I'll see you next time, here on the Flophouse Files. When poring over old case files, you'll start seeing the same names over and over eventually, and I've noticed this particular blue and yellow logo has popped up more than its fair share. If you then dig a little deeper, you'll exhume the fantastical and well-loved Darkstalkers franchise, something Capcom is now relegated to costume packs and cameos, which it should count its lucky stars for, instead of being, these guys. Darkstalkers was once considered their second biggest all-original fighting game franchise, having seen several sequels, merchandise, manga, comics, anime, and other adaptations to its credit.
Welcome back to the world of the weird. I'm your host, Lily LeMay, and we're chatting with my guest, Morgan Anslade, a succubus, and we're talking about evil.
But it has since slowed down, way down. But why is that? Capcom has resurrected a good amount of its older IPs and even other fighting games, but these ghouls and ghosties of the night have yet to rise from their coffins, not having seen any sort of re-release for the last 6 years, and not seeing a completely new release for the last 21. Jesus Christ, how long have I been doing this? But wait, I know what you're thinking. I thought Darkstalkers were not dead. Wasn't there a new game coming or something? Well, fellow gumshoes, that's the question we're going to answer. This is the case of the missing Midnight Monsters. In the early 90s, Capcom unleashed their revolutionary CPS2 arcade board, which allowed for more fluid animation, massive sprites, and additional effects. And while their first full game to take advantage of the technology was Children of the Atom, allowing the player to beat up Cyclops in a variety of ways, Darkstalkers was their first all-original, non-licensed fighting title to be running on the board outside of Super Turbo. And hot damn did they ever take advantage of it. bulging limbs, falling sarcophagi, legs turning into chainsaws, packs of catgirls, and beans made of pure cosmic hellfire, and all manner of things that went bump in the night. What followed were two fantastic sequels that added even more features and characters in the traditional Capcom style. Then, for a long time, nothing happened. It was as silent as the grave until 2005, where the franchise was kinda brought back with not one, but two re-releases. The Sony PSP received Darkstalkers: The Chaos Tower, which, despite the fancy schmancy subtitle, was a repackage of the trilogy. It was its own game, you simply choose which, for lack of a better term, the groove of which monster you wanted to play as. Darkstalkers 1 Rikuyo versus Night Warriors Rikuyo? Yeah, you can do that, and really, who could resist?
Even though you are curiously attractive for a scaly freak.
The PS2 received Vampire: The Darkstalkers Collection, which was a more straightforward package of the 5 games in the series, including the Japanese versions. Now, this particular collection never saw the light of the moon outside Japan, and to this day has remained a rare import. Then, for a long time, nothing happened. Again. Now, those two re-releases are important, as they are, in a weird roundabout way, the linchpins to this entire story. In 2010, 5 years later, Capcom was set to announce a brand new fighting game, and with Marvel vs. Capcom 3, Fate of the Bad logo, already being revealed earlier that year, fans have been chomping at the bit in anticipation for a brand new Darkstalkers title. I mean, what could it else be, Cross-Tekken? So yes, if you were a fan of vampires, undead samurai, and sexy cat dames, your dark wishes were denied, and Capcom went silent once more. Now, it's true that various other Night Warriors, only really Morgan and Felicia, and maybe there was one other, they popped up in other games, but that was about it. It seemed that these mighty monsters would be joining that massive stable of Capcom franchises that would most likely never get another shot at the big time. Not too long after Cross-Tekken's debut, internally, within Capcom there are whispers, barely heard on the night wind, that they were considering doing something with those that stalk the dark. Fans would constantly question Yoshinori Ono about the possibility of a new game, who, for his part, would reply with a coy smile. This was the man who almost single-handedly brought back Street Fighter, so surely he could do the same for Felicia and Morgan and all the others, I guess. The news that blood was potentially pumping through the dead body of the franchise reached the ears of Udon Entertainment, who had a long working relationship with Capcom, having made comics and games based on their properties for years. Udon's director of publishing, Matt Moylan, revealed that they decided to pounce on this opportunity. In 2011, we learned of a project in development at Capcom involving Darkstalkers. Having done Super Street Fighter II Turbo HD Remix, we took it on ourselves to pitch the same idea for Darkstalkers, to redraw the sprites in higher resolution. So we brought the idea to producer Yoshinori Ono, but were turned down without much feedback. In one way, I understand, because it would have been much more daunting than Street Fighter II. At the same time, it probably would have looked even better than HD Remix, since the characters are so well animated to begin with. So, wait a minute, in 2011, Udon heard that Capcom had a project in development. Which project would that be? Well, Ono did drop a hint to fans, as he does, at Comic-Con 2011, telling fans that Darkstalkers are not dead, and took a picture of the audience holding up their own money as a way to let Capcom know that fans want a thing. Teases and hints continued for almost a whole more year. It was then at the 2012 NYC Comic-Con when an elaborate trailer was shown to fans that, to many, confirmed a brand new title was in the works. Just looking at this grainy, handheld footage, you can see some actual moolah was thrown at this thing, but not enough moolah for Capcom to actually put a direct feed video version online. Anywhere. Curious. It really is rather strange. Imagine if, say, Sega showed a big elaborate trailer for a new Virtua Fighter at a live event, but then never showed it again. They would actually do that. Regardless, Darkstalkers Resurrection for the PS3 and the Xbox 360 was announced shortly after that trailer, and if you happened to be in that room, you might have heard a collective deflating sigh, because it was a third Darkstalkers re-release that repackaged the old games rather than, be a new one. It's really rather bittersweet, because Resurrection was another in a long line of outstanding HD ports that Iron Galaxy, who also did Marvel Origins and Third Strike HD, were handling. Galleries filled with content, in-game achievements, filters, rollback netcode, and a stellar presentation. The problem, of course, was that this was one of the dreaded Capcom tests, which was a moniker that carried negative connotations around that time. Capcom released things that people didn't necessarily want or need, but it was a test to see if they'd vote with their dollars, and more often than not, they would learn the wrong lessons from it. Will you kids who own a Wii buy a port of Resident Evil 4, a 2-year-old game? Oh, you will! Holy crackers, well, curl that finger on that monkey's paw, cause here's Umbrella Chronicles! Oh, that sold like almost 2 million copies. Well, here's Darkside Chronicles! It's not really what the fans wanted.
That's not what I want!
This was simply the time frame where the Capcom test felt many a comeback for many of their franchises. In this instance, though, they were transparent with the intention of Darkstalkers Resurrection. In this instance, though, they were transparent with the intention of Darkstalkers Resurrection, with many employees, Ono most notably, saying up front that if Resurrection sells well, then fans would get what they wanted. Unfortunately, Darkstalkers always lagged behind Street Fighter in popularity, and the Versus Fighters too, even in its heyday, so charging money for 20-year-old games was not the best indicator of popularity, especially when it had been done 2 times previous. Thus, Capcom was not beating around the bush, and was quick to let fans know that the full Resurrection was going to be cancelled. Then Capcom's senior vice president on the old Unity forums explained when asked about the HD Darkstalkers placing high in monthly digital sales on the PlayStation Store with this: sadly, it's not as high on that list as it really needs to be successful. I'm disappointed in the opening sales response relative to any other fighting title we put out on the same platforms, given the frequency and urgency of requests we've had here over the last several years, and the quality of the execution. It is the most fully featured and probably best project of this type that we've done. That's because fans wanted a new game with polygonal Street Fighter 4 graphics and over-the-top action, not another digital collection, in which Capcom is releasing almost every other month. But then, why the big elaborate CG trailer? It wasn't even included as a bonus in the galleries or used as an intro. Why turn down the HD remix from Udon? It kinda almost seemed like Ono wanted to get more ambitious, but was told to hold his undead horses, as the Capcom test needed to be trotted out first. Was a fully original, brand new Darkstalkers game in the planning stages at some point, but then was quickly halted in favor of a cheaper release? I don't know, but my gut says maybe. Years later, the former head of Capcom brand marketing and esports, Matt Dahlgren, threw further dirt on the grave of the franchise when he said there was nothing Darkstalkers on the immediate horizon for sure, which was something also shared by Ono himself. My apologies, we won't be releasing a new installment in the Darkstalkers series anytime soon, as we didn't manage to hit our sales targets for Darkstalkers Resurrection. A picture begins to form here. While Street Fighter 4 and its many versions proved to be a big hit, it's very possible the failure of Cross Tekken and the sluggish sales of Resurrection was the 1-2 chain combo that convinced Capcom they needed to hold back on their fighting game output going forward. To risk even more on a fully fledged Darkstalkers title was probably seen as too risky of a venture. It's been 6 years since Resurrection, and it's currently still locked on the Xbox 360 and PS3, not even getting backwards compatibility on current consoles or even a PC version, with zero indication that'll ever change. So, much like Power Stone, Rival Schools, or Final Fight, or Techromancer, Cyberbots, or Star Gladiator, it's sadly safe to say that the Night Warriors will be forever destined to remain as silly Street Fighter costumes versus game slots or Tekken cards. And thus the case of the missing Midnight Monsters is closed. Know of any other cases we can get down and dirty with? Post them up in the comments below or slip into the offices of our Patreon to nominate a case you want to see. Thanks again to our fellow Gumshoe Unnamed Bird Versus for nominating this episode. And with that, we'll see you next time on the Flophouse Files. It's been a little while since our last case here on the Flophouse Files, and while we've already combed through some fighting game fables before, specifically about perennial suspect Sega, we're cracking open our books once again. Now, when people usually think of this Japanese publisher in fighting games, their minds immediately jump to the sharp polygons and moon jumps of Virtua Fighter, its flagship fighting franchise. It was Sega's Street Fighter II for all intents and purposes, and for the majority of the 90s and the early 2000s, it was their arcade crown jewel. Now, while the Eternal Champions were sacrificed for the mighty and highfalutin Virtua Fighters in the Great War between Sega US and Sega Japan, VF wound up suffering its own drawn-out death march of non-existence. Hell, come to think of it, Sega's entire fighting game lineup shriveled like a rotten grape in the hot sun. Why, you ask? Well, with help from frequent contributor Morales, let's get to the bottom of the case of the Forgotten Phantom Fighters. It all started when this polygonal powerhouse released in 1993, which is a lie. Well, yeah, I mean Virtua Fighter did release in 93, but the first chapter of Sega's fighting game history didn't start with it. In fact, there were two others which predated it. When Street Fighter II pile droved the arcade scene in 1991, Sega was quick to try to ape its success, but didn't exactly achieve that end goal.
It's always great to see guys in good shape.
Colosseum was a bizarre, early attempt to replicate a traditional one-on-one martial arts experience, but without all the clutter of backgrounds or compelling characters or anything really. It felt more like a simulator in the strictest sense. It leaned more towards simplistic mechanics and lacked much flash, but to its credit, had some very swanky animation. It hit arcades in December of 1992, and if you've never heard of it, well, there's a reason. It wasn't much of a monetary success and never saw a single home port. Then, just 1 month later, in January of 1993, Sega released a vastly different option to hopefully capture the imaginations and quarters of fight game fans. This was Dark Edge, a futuristic 2D, 3D hybrid that, even in 2021, is quite the thing to look at. Check out those gams! Now, while composed entirely of sprites, which the game would rotate and scale the bejesus out of on the fly, it allowed characters to circle and maneuver around each other in a fake three-dimensional way. Despite looking this impressive, it was hard though to judge the distance between you and your foe, and was probably responsible for younger fans chucking their lunches on the floors of their local arcade. And much like Colosseum, it also failed to light up Sega's coin-op profits. Now, while those two games were being crafted by separate teams, Sega still had yet another iron in the fire in their stubborn bid for fighting supremacy. Yu Suzuki, who was behind a string of massive hits for the company, was the logical and perhaps last choice that they were going to take on this newfangled fighting game fad. Fortunately, Yu Suzuki and his team wound up making history with Virtua Fighter, the first 3D fighting game ever and a watershed moment for polygonal-based development in general. A lot of decisions on VF were made to keep the gameplay simple to understand as possible, with 1 punch, 1 kick, and 1 block. With that said, within that 3-button setup were dozens of varied moves, throws, and combinations per character, leading to a very robust fighting system. AM2, the team that Suzuki headed up, also favored lightning-fast action, with 30 seconds per round to duke it out, with almost every move dealing out incredibly high damage. Marry that with impactful sound effects, iconic quotes, "I win!" and finally a sublime soundtrack, and it should be no surprise that it was an instant hit all over the globe. Yeah, the backgrounds were simplistic, but it was to help you focus on the action, because these Virtua Fighters didn't pick the ballroom, they just danced. While the game was meant to invoke 90s virtual reality with its blocky polygonal warriors, it also helped the team hone in on simple but distinct personalities and archetypes for every member of the roster. Virtua Fighter exploded in popularity, spawning special re-releases, ports, spin-offs, and even cameos in other Sega games. So it didn't take long for headhunters at Namco, Sega's old arcade rival, to come sniffing around for talent to poach. Several staff members who had worked on Virtua Fighter were then lured away from AM2 and wound up molding Tekken into the massive success it is today, which is something that would have ramifications down the line. A Virtua Fighter sequel was then put into immediate production, this time running off the improved Model 2 engine. Released in late '94 in Japan and January '95 elsewhere, Virtua Fighter 2 saw improved textures, more polygons, better lighting, and added 2 new fighters. Older Man, and Young Boy. While it played fundamentally the same, its improvements in visuals and presentation put it heads and shoulders above Tekken 1, which released at almost the exact same time. Sega knew they now had the bedrock to build upon, and much like Street Fighter II, they decided to pump out more games with the same template. The most famous of these was Fighting Vipers, which took VF's basic gameplay setup but added a few important flourishes. The characters took on a more wild look, liberally lifting from whatever's popular in the 90s. Extreme sports, music, anime, all that jazz. Walled-off cages constructed around the rings were introduced, which would lead to an added selection of moves, and finally, if you landed enough hits to an opponent's lower or upper half, their armor would break off in spectacular fashion, leaving them in a weakened state, and, of course, with less clothing. Check out those games! Since the control layout of these games proved to be popular and the Model 2 engine easy to program, Sega then thought it would work with franchises outside of the fighting game space. Hence, Sonic the Fighters. Now, while not nearly the success it probably seemed like it was going to be on paper, having Sonic and his super popular chums duking it out in 3D brawls didn't exactly translate all that well, and the reception was mixed to say the least. Still though, it was worth a shot. I mean, look at this, it's just so stupid that it's amazing. But that's not all though. Sega's fighting game boom even caught the eye of other companies who found themselves on the ropes in the mid-90s, with one such company being Tecmo. On the brink of bankruptcy, they desperately needed a hit, and so they licensed the Model 2 engine from Sega to produce the first Dead or Alive, which is why both games shared a lot in common in terms of their mechanics, although, obviously, they added some accoutrements. So, 1996 was really a banger year for AM2, as they probably hit their peak, evidenced of course by the wild and wacky Fighters Megamix. This was a love letter to all of AM2's arcade output, and not just of the pugilistic variety. I mean, yeah, that was the main draw, but that didn't mean other characters from Sonic, Virtua Cop, and Daytona couldn't join the fray. While it was certainly a gas, it was not meant to be a serious competitive fighter, but more of a goofy mashup to appeal to casual fans. That unfortunately meant it didn't exactly translate directly to record profits, and that might be because of a bit of oversaturation on Sega's part. The original Vipers was released in US arcades at the top of '96, followed by Sonic, which was then followed up again by Megamix, and yet another completely separate game after that. This time, developed by AM3, who had just finished Virtua On. Wait, no? It's Virtual? This isn't part of the Virtua-verse? Weird. Anyway, AM3 were also the team who made Dark Edge, funnily enough. This new game, however, was Last Bronx, and it set itself apart with its usage of weapons, as well as its characters, which borrowed heavily from Japanese street fashion. While certainly a competent game, it saw even less success than Vipers, and didn't even get close to sniffing a sequel. Oh, and remember when I said that this was the last fighter Sega put out in 1996? Yep, I lied again. There was one more, and it wound up being pretty important in the grand scheme of things. Virtua Fighter 3, running on the new Model 3, was, at the time, the most graphically advanced video game in the world. Just for comparison's sake, let's stack it up against another famous 3D innovator, also released in 1996, and yeah, that's pretty much night and day. Unfortunately, for as good as it looked, VF3 started to vary things up to a mostly tepid response. It introduced uneven terrain in its stages, which could give tactical advantages as you navigated them via the new button, Dodge, as well as 2 new fighters. Despite these changes, though, there was a certain apathy towards VF3, and when you got deeper into the mechanics, it wasn't a gigantic leap forward. This is also the point where Tekken started to overtake Virtua Fighter, especially outside Japan, and especially even more on the PlayStation, which had trounced the Sega Saturn in sales since, well, the very beginning. This greatly bit into the console popularity cherry pie for Sega's franchise, which was further exemplified in 1997 when the home port of Tekken 3 managed to sell 8.5 million copies, which, by a very narrow margin, was just shy of how many Sega Saturn consoles were ever even sold. Virtua Fighter 3 TB, which stood for Team Battle, was seen by some as a underwhelming port, featuring added bugs and very little new or exclusive content, and really, it paled in comparison when stacked up against Namco's own mighty Soul Calibur. Now, let's be honest with ourselves, Soul Calibur was the fighter to get in 1999, and was a more polished, value-filled package that actually did make the Dreamcast's launch, boosting its visibility. So, it was swords and souls that became synonymous with the Dreamcast, and not Virtua Fighter. Therefore, if the flagship series was struggling, then its sister games certainly were as well. The Fighting Vipers sequel, appropriately titled Fighting Vipers 2, saw a Dreamcast port in Japan and Europe, and that's it, which really said it all. And after that, it was all pretty much downhill. Sega's withdrawal from the hardware business after the Dreamcast's commercial failure meant they had to tighten the old belt, and that meant that their arcade business would need to be scaled back. So, no more Vipers, Hedgehogs, or Last Bronxes. But Virtua Fighter remained, as it was still very much a force in Japan. It wasn't all doom and gloom, though, as the franchise could now branch out on far more popular machines like the mighty PS2. Hell, Sony's Juggernaut even played host to an obscure Sega Ages port of Last Bronx of all things, and it didn't sell very well. Virtua Fighter 4, however, running on the Sega Naomi board in arcades, flourished on the PlayStation 2, where it wound up being the most successful home port of the entire franchise, selling over 1.5 million copies. It was so successful that this fourth entry saw several distinct releases and revisions, including Evolution, 10th Anniversary Edition, and Final Tuned. However, the deeper the 2000s wore on, the further fighting game profits would plunge, as arcade earnings dwindled in many western parts of the world. And there was yet another problem. Yu Suzuki's costly development of Shenmue and its subsequent failure to recoup said costs decreased his standing within Sega, and after Virtua Fighter 4, he took on a much more hands-off approach to game development. Thus, Virtua Fighter 5 was developed without his direct involvement, and by the time it saw a home port in 2007, the financial viability of fighting games were at an all-time low. New entries in Tekken saw a fraction of the sales that its third entry had enjoyed, so things were down across the board. Similarly, VF5's timed PS3 exclusive debut started not with a roar, but a whimper, with much of that having to do with the PS3's own hamstrung performance for the first few years of its life. Also, lacking any form of online play in 2007 usually does a fighting game no favors. Now, while that would be rectified by the eventual Xbox 360 version released months later, the damage had already been done. Sega still hadn't completely thrown in the towel just yet, only mostly. Virtua Fighter 5's latest arcade revision, Final Showdown, came to both the PS3 and Xbox 360 in 2012, both with online, but both downgraded to a digital-only release. While this is considered one of the best entries in the entire series, and it hit its Japanese sales targets, it again did not perform up to the publisher's standards elsewhere in the world. So there it is, Sega's last official fighting game as of right now. Usually it takes a senior producer or director to spearhead the resurrection of an IP, but with Yu Suzuki having long departed the company, VF has remained dormant for the last 9 years, aside from Mobile Drek, of course. There have been some random bare-bones Model 2 arcade ports farted out onto the Xbox 360 and PS3 here and there, but that's pretty much it. Oh wait! How could I forget? There is one version of Virtua Fighter that Sega is more than happy to re-release over and over and over again. Fortunately, there is one last, potentially happy chapter left in this story. A Korean ratings board posted up a listing that says, in black and white, Virtua Fighter 5 Ultimate Showdown for the PS4. Furthermore, this image leaked on a PSN trophy list just a few weeks ago, so it's almost a sure thing that this is legit. Something is happening. Oh, sure, it's not a brand new sequel or even a collection of all the prior games with online, but it is something. If people want this legendary series to return in full force, though, they're going to need to support it with cold hard digital cash. It's been almost a decade since the last Virtua release, and fighting games have been back for most of, if not all of that time. Tekken 7 is now the second most successful Iron Fist of all time, and MK11 was the 5th best-selling game in general of all of 2019. So the fighting game is hot once again. If there was ever a time for Akira, Pai, and Wolf to return to the ring, it's now. The fans are ready. Throughout this investigation, we've seen how simple misjudgments in timing, platforms, and oversaturation led to a fighting game dynasty falling apart in a few short years. So, time will tell if Sega has learned from their mistakes. Thanks to Morales once again for sliding this case file across my desk. And if you'd like to submit your own gaming industry mystery, curio, or phenomena, let me know in the comments below or head on over to the Flophouse VIP offices to nominate the case you want me to get to the bottom of next. Until then, I'll see you next time on the Flophouse Files.